Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm going to be streaming the 3 more chapters of A Christmas Carol. The rest of the chapters will come tomorrow because there's 9 chapters only. And while I'm doing it, I'm just going to be playing like Snowball Mayhem or something in Guild Wars. I did the Diamond Puzzle yesterday, so why not? Let me start there. Okay, here we go.
A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Episode 4, Master Fezziwig. Although Scrooge and the ghost had, but that moment, left the school behind them, they were now in the streets of a busy city, where shadowy passengers passed and shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way. It was plain enough that here, too, it was Christmas time again. But it was evening, and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. "Know it?" said Scrooge. "I was an apprentice here." They went in. At the sight of an old gentleman in a wig, sitting behind such a high desk that if he'd been 2 inches taller, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling, Scrooge cried in great excitement, "Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart! It's Fezziwig, alive again!" Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, and called out in a jovial voice, "Yo-ho there, Ebenezer! Dick!" Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice, Dick. "Dick Wilkins, to be sure," said Scrooge to the ghost. "Bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick. Dear, dear." "Yo-ho, my boys," said Fezziwig. "No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Clear away, my lads, and let's have lots more room here. Hilly-o, Dick. Chirrup, Ebenezer. Clear away." It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off. The floor was swept and fuel was heaped upon the fire. The warehouse was as snug and bright a ballroom as you could desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her brother's friend, the milkman. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow. And away they all went, 20 couples at once, hands half round and back again the other way, down the middle and up again. Old Fezziwig cried out, "Well done!" And the fiddler began again, and there were more dances, and there were games and more dances, and then there was cake, and there was a great cold roast, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came when old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. And when old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone all through the dance, advance and retire, hold hands with your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle and back again to your place, Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs and came upon his feet again without a stagger. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the 2 apprentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self. He remembered everything and enjoyed everything. It was not until now, when the bright faces of his former self and Dick were turned from them, that he remembered the ghost and became conscious that it was looking full upon him, while the light upon its head burnt very clear. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude." "Small," echoed Scrooge. The spirit signed to him to listen to the two apprentices, who were pouring out their hearts in praise of Fezziwig, and when Scrooge had done so, the spirit said, "Why, is it not? He spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?" "It isn't that," said Scrooge, heated by the remark, and speaking unconsciously like his former, not his latter self. "It isn't that, spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune." He felt the spirit's glance and stopped. "What's the matter?" asked the ghost. "Nothing particular," said Scrooge. "Something, I think," the ghost insisted. "No," said Scrooge. "No. I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk, Bob Cratchit, just now. That's all." Scrooge's former self turned down the lamps, and Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in the open air. "My time grows short," observed the spirit. "Quick." This was not addressed to Scrooge or to anyone whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect, for again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of his life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but there was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye, which showed the passion that had taken root. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young woman, in whose eyes there were tears, which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past. "It matters little," she said softly, "to you, very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I've no just cause to grieve." "What idol has displaced you?" he asked. "A golden one, the pursuit of wealth. I've seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one, until the master passion, gain, engrosses you." "What then?" he retorted. "Even if I've grown so much wiser, what then? I am not changed towards you." She shook her head. "Am I?" he asked. "Our engagement is an old one," she said. "It was made when we were both poor and content to be so. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man." "Have I ever sought release?" he asked. "In words, no, never," she said. "In what then?" "In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in everything that made my love of any worth or value in your sight. If this had never been between us," she said, looking mildly but with steadiness upon him, "tell me, would you seek me out and try to win me now?" He seemed to yield to the justice of this in spite of himself, but he said with a struggle, "You think not?" "I would gladly think otherwise if I could," she answered. "Heaven knows. But if you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday, can I even believe that you would choose a girl without a dowry? You who weigh everything by gain? I release you, with a full heart, for the love of him you once were." He was about to speak, but with her head turned from him, she resumed. You may have pain in this now, but a very brief time from now, and you will dismiss the recollection of it gladly as an unprofitable dream from which it happened well that you awoke. May you be happy in the life you've chosen." She left him, and they parted. "Spirit," said Scrooge, "show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight to torture me?" "One shadow more," exclaimed the ghost. "No more!" cried Scrooge. "No more! I don't wish to see it! Show me no more!" But the relentless ghost pinioned him in both his arms and forced him to observe what happened next. They were in another scene and place, a room not very large or handsome, but full of comfort. Near to the winter fire sat a beautiful young girl, so like that last that Scrooge believed it was the same, until he saw her, now grown older, sitting opposite her daughter. The noise in this room was perfectly tumultuous, for there were more children there than Scrooge in his agitated state of mind could count, and every child was conducting itself like 40. The consequences were uproarious beyond belief, but no one seemed to care. On the contrary, the mother and daughter laughed heartily and enjoyed it very much. Now a knocking at the door was heard, and such a rush immediately ensued that the daughter, with a laughing face, was borne towards it at the centre of a flushed and boisterous group, just in time to greet the father, who came home, attended by a man laden with Christmas toys and presents. Then the shouting and the struggling, and the onslaught that was made on the defenceless porter, the scaling him with chairs for ladders to dive into his pockets and despoil him of brown paper parcels, hold on tight by his cravat, hug him round the neck, pommel his back and kick his legs in irrepressible affection. The shouts of wonder and delight with which the development of every package was received, the joy and gratitude and ecstasy, they are all indescribable. It's enough that by degrees the children got out of the parlour, and by one stair at a time up to the top of the house, where they went to bed. And now Scrooge looked on more attentively than ever when the master of the house, having his daughter leaning fondly on him, sat down with her and her mother at his own fireside. And when he thought that such another creature quite as graceful and as full of promise might have called him father, and been a springtime in the winter of his life, his sight grew very dim indeed. "I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon," said the husband, turning to his wife with a smile. "Who was it?" she inquired. "Guess." "How can I? I don't know," she added in the same breath, laughing as he laughed. Mr. Scrooge." "Mr. Scrooge it was," said her husband. "I passed his office window, and as it was not shut up, and because he had a candle inside, I could scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies upon the point of death, I hear, and there he sat alone. Quite alone in the world, I do believe." "Spirit," said Scrooge in a broken voice, "remove me from this place." "I told you these were shadows of the things that have been," said the ghost. "That they are what they are, do not blame me." "Remove me!" Scrooge exclaimed. "I cannot bear it!" He turned upon the ghost and began to wrestle with it. "Leave me! Take me back! Haunt me no longer!" In the struggle, Scrooge was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness. He relaxed and had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep.
This is the BBC.
This podcast is...
No, that's all wrong. Oh my god, these teammates suck! Like, holy shit, they suck! That's not in a second.
A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Episode 5. The second of the three spirits. Awakening and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. But being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when the bell struck 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. All this time, as he lay upon his bed, a blaze of ruddy light streamed upon the clock, which Scrooge began to think at last might be coming from the adjoining room. This idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by his name and bade him enter. He obeyed. It was his own room, there was no doubt about that. But it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were hung with living green, from every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe and ivy reflected back the light as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney. Heaped upon the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, great joints of meat, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. Upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch which he held up high to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door. "Come in!" exclaimed the ghost. "Come in and know me better." Scrooge entered timidly. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, and though the spirit's eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet them. "I am the ghost of Christmas Present," said the spirit. "Look upon me." Scrooge did so. It was clothed in one simple green robe, bordered with white fur. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its cheery voice, and its joyful air. "You've never seen the like of me before," exclaimed the spirit. "Never," Scrooge made answer. The ghost of Christmas Present rose. "Spirit," said Scrooge submissively, "conduct me where you will. I went forth last night, and I learned a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it." "Touch my robe," said the spirit. Scrooge did as he was told, and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, all vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow. They stood, invisible as before, in the suburbs of the town on Christmas morning, before the house of Scrooge's clerk, Bob Cratchit. Up rose Mrs. Cratchit, dressed poorly, but brave in ribbons which are cheap and make a goodly show for sixpence, and she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes. Now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and known it for their own. And basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies while he blew the fire until the slow potatoes, bubbling up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. "What has ever got your father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother, Tiny Tim, and your sister Martha weren't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother," said a girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, mother," cried 2 young Cratchits. "Hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha." "Well, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are," said Mrs. Cratchit. "We'd a deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl, "and had to clear away this morning, mother." "Well, never mind, so long as you're come," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm." "No, no, there's father coming," cried the 2 young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came Bob, the father, in his threadbare clothes, with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob, looking around. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming?" said Bob. "Not coming upon Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, even if it were only in joke. So she came out from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house that he might hear the pudding singing in the pot. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit when Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "Good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he'd hoped that the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire. Bob turned up his cuffs and compounded some hot mixture in a jug, and stirred it round and round, and put it on the hob to simmer, while Master Peter and 2 young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon, and, in truth, it was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigour. Miss Belinda sweetened up the apple sauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The 2 young Cratchits set chairs for everybody. At last the dishes were set, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit looked slowly all along the carving knife, preparing to plunge it in the goose. And when she did, and the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all round the table, and even Tiny Tim beat on the table with the handle of his knife, and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavour, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by apple sauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. The plates were changed by Miss Belinda, and now Mrs. Cratchit left the room to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose. All sorts of horrors were supposed by Mrs. Cratchit. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit returned, flushed but smiling proudly with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in ignited brandy, and with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, a wonderful pudding! Bob Cratchit said that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind, she would confess that she had had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all small pudding for such a large family. At last the dinner was done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts upon the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and the crutch without an owner carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "Oh no," said Scrooge. "Oh no, kind spirit. Say he'll be spared." "If he be like to die," returned the ghost, "he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. He bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling, cast his eyes upon the ground. But he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob. "I give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon." "My dear," said Bob, "the children, Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I am sure," said she, "on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day." "I'll drink his health for your sake and the Day's," said Mrs. Cratchit, "not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt," she added. The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge being done with. Bob told them how he'd inquired about a job for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 shillings and 6pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favour when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. All this time the chestnuts and the jug went round and round, and by they had a song about a lost child travelling in the snow, from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented. And when they faded and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last.
Wait, I'll put the next one on.
This and other downloads from School Radio.
Blah, 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 blah. There we go.
A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Episode 6. Scrooge's Nephew. By this time, it was getting dark and snowing pretty heavily. And as Scrooge and the Spirit went along the streets, the brightness of all the roaring fires in kitchens, parlours and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze showed preparations for a cosy dinner and curtains ready to be drawn to shut out cold and darkness. There all the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and be the first to greet them. If you had judged from the numbers of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might have thought that no one was at home to give them welcome when they got there. How the ghost exulted! How it poured its bright and harmless mirth on everything within its reach! And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak moor, where nothing grew but moss and furze and coarse rank grass. Down in the west, the setting sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant like a sullen eye, and frowning lower, 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 was lost in the thick gloom of darkest night. "What place is this?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live, who labour in the bowels of the earth," returned the Spirit. "But they know me, see?" A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced towards it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled around a glowing fire. An old man and woman, with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind, was singing them a Christmas song, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus. The Spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, and passing on above the moor, sped towards the sea. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land behind them, and his ears were deafened by the thundering of water as it rolled and roared and raged. Built upon a reef of sunken rocks, there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds rose and fell about it, like the waves they skimmed. But even here, the two men who watched the lighthouse light had made a fire that shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea. Joining their hands over the rough table at which they sat, they wished each other Merry Christmas, and one of them, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, as the figurehead of an old ship might be, struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on above the black and heaving sea, on, until, being far away, as he told Scrooge, from any shore, they lighted on a ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the officers on watch, dark, ghostly figures. But every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day. And every man on board had remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognise it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at the same nephew with approving affability. "Ha ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha ha!" If you should happen, by any unlikely chance, to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. There is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humour. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends roared out lustily. "Ha ha ha! He said that Christmas was humbug, as I live!" cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it too." "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. "He's a comical old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew. "That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him." "I'm sure he's very rich, Fred," hinted Scrooge's niece. "At least you always tell me so." "What of that, my dear?" said Scrooge's nephew. "His wealth is of no use to him. He doesn't do any good with it." "I have no patience with him," observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. "Oh, I have," said Scrooge's nephew. "I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. He takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He doesn't lose much of a dinner." "Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner," interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner. "Well, I'm very glad to hear it," said Scrooge's nephew. "I just wish to say that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him no harm. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him if he finds me going there in good temper year after year and saying, 'Uncle Scrooge, how are you?' if it only puts him in the mood to leave his poor clerk £50. That's something." After tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played, among other things, a simple little tune which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. When this strain of music sounded, all the things that ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often, years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of life for his own happiness. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while, they played at forfeits. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge, for, wholly forgetting what was going on, and that his voice made no sound in their ears, he sometimes came out with his guest quite loud, and very often guessed quite right too, for the sharpest needle was not sharper than Scrooge. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him so kindly that Scrooge begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guest departed. But this the spirit said could not be done. "Here's a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half-hour, spirit, only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what it was, he only answering to their questions yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and was not a horse, or an ass, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, his nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last, someone cried out, "I found it out. I know what it is. Fred, I know what it is." "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge." It certainly was, though some objected that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes, inasmuch as an answer in the negative was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge. "He's given us plenty of merriment, I'm sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine, and I say, Uncle Scrooge." "Well, Uncle Scrooge," they cried. "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, wherever he is," said Scrooge's nephew. Scrooge had become so gay and light of heart that he would have toasted the unconscious company in return and thanked them in an audible speech, if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful; by struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope; by poverty, and it was rich; in almshouse, hospital, and jail; in misery's every refuge, where vain man had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubts of this, because while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until they stood together in an open place, and Scrooge noticed that the spirit's hair was grey. "Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight?" cried Scrooge. "Tonight at midnight. Hark! The time is drawing near." The chimes were ringing the 11:15 at that moment. "Forgive me if I'm not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe, "but I see something strange, and not belonging to yourself, protruding from your robe." From the foldings of its robe, the spirit brought 2 children, wretched and miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. They were a boy and girl, meagre, ragged, scowling, and wolfish. Scrooge started back appalled. Having them shown to him in this way, he tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. Spirit? Are they yours? Scrooge could say no more. They are mankind's, said the spirit, looking down upon them. This boy is ignorance. This girl is want. Beware them both, and all of their degree. But most of all, beware this boy. For on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased, cried the spirit, stretching out its hand towards the city. Have they no refuge? Cried Scrooge. Are there no prisons? Said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. Are there no workhouses? The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him.
Oh, dang. Oh, that was all three. It was kind of fast. I was enjoying that. I'm just too good at Snowball Mayhem. I'm kind of over it already. What to do now? I don't know if everyone's doing the raid yet.
Your attention, please.
I can't even hit any of these objects. I have a melee weapon.
Joy to the world.
Oh, special objects.
Let earth receive her King. Let every heart prepare him rule. And heaven and nature sing. And heaven and nature sing. And heaven and nature sing. Joy to the world, the Savior reigns. Let men their songs employ, while fields and floods, rocks, hills and plains repeat the sounding joy. Repeat the sounding joy. Repeat the sounding.
Oh wait, my weapon should be festive too. How about that?
No more let sins and sorrows grow. No thorns infest the ground.
Where is it?
He comes to make
as a present.
Blessings
There you go.
flow, for as the curse is found, for as the curse is found, for as the curse is found.
Where is that torch?
He rules the world with truth and grace, and makes the nations prove the
Wait, what?
glories of his righteousness.
That's so weird, I couldn't apply for him now.
Wonders of his love, and wonders of his love, and wonders of his love.
No more presents. What the fuck? I have a pulsing aura? Yeah. Oh, I'm leeching everything and it's destroying it. It's hilarious. Sense. Go paint the toys. They're changing me colors. Oh, it's not in there. We do use the princess dolls. Any in here?
Congratulate attention. Crisis in progress.
to me a partridge in a pear tree. On the second day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 2 turtle doves and a partridge in a pear tree. On the third day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. On the fourth day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. On the fifth day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 5 golden rings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. On the 6th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 6 geese a-laying, 5 golden rings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. On the 7th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 7 swans a-singing, 6 geese a-laying, 5 golden rings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. On the 8th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 8 maids a-milking, 7 swans a-swimming, 6 geese a-laying, 5 golden rings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree.
Dang it. Come on, where's this stupid plant food? Never mind.
required. All targets must remain still.
First Noel, the angel did say, was to certain poor shepherds in fields as they lay, in fields where they lay keeping their sheep on a cold winter's night that was so deep. Noel, 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 born is the King of Israel. They looked up and saw a star shining in the east, beyond them far, and to the earth.
Okay. Fortunately, I need to go to bed early because it's Christmas Eve and I've got stuff to do tomorrow, obviously. Which I want to do more. Oh, bonfire! Get that first. So, I bid everyone a Merry Christmas. But I'll still be on tomorrow, just not, no idea when. Times may vary. But everyone, Merry Christmas. Thanks for watching and listening to the stories. If you missed it, just go back to the start of the stream. It's there. Anyway, don't forget to follow, subscribe, like, you know what, whatever you want. I don't really mind. Just do whatever. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.
Of Israel.